What would you do if the people you loved most turned their backs on you in your darkest hour, choosing a concert over your life and death surgery? Abigail Carter faced that betrayal, clutching her trembling twins in a sterile hospital room as the knife of pain twisted deeper in her gut. But when a hidden truth about her late husband's downfall unraveled, it sparked a fire that could either destroy her family or set her free. Hit that subscribe button and join us on this emotional roller coaster. We're aiming for our first 1,000 subscribers to keep sharing stories that matter. The sterile scent of antiseptic stung Abigail Carter's nostrils as she lay on the hospital bed at Las Vegas Medical Center, her trembling hands clutching the thin blanket draped over her. It was Christmas Eve, a night meant for laughter and warmth, but the room was cold. The only sounds, the soft beeping of the heart monitor and the faint giggles of her 2-year-old twins, Liam and Ava, playing with a stack of colorful blocks in the corner. Pain twisted through Abby's abdomen like a jagged blade, each wave a reminder of the internal bleeding the doctors had found. Complications tied to the stress and grief that had haunted her since her husband Nate's death 6 months ago. She glanced at her phone, her thumb hovering over the video call button, her heart pounding with a desperate hope that this time, her parents might show her the love she'd craved her whole life. Abby had always been the afterthought in her family, the shadow cast by her younger sister Lauren, the golden child who could do no wrong. Growing up in a modest suburb of Las Vegas, Abby had watched her parents, William Bill and Elizabeth Liz, shower Lauren with praise for every small achievement. A school play, a cheerleading trophy, while her own milestones went unnoticed. When she graduated college with honors, they didn't show up. Lauren had landed a local commercial gig the same weekend, and that took precedence. When she married Nate, they complained the venue was too far from their home. Even when Liam and Ava were born, they visited only once, muttering that the babies were too fussy before leaving after 20 minutes. Nate had been her rock through it all, a man who understood the sting of family disappointment, having cut ties with his own father years before. "We'll build our own family, Abby," he'd promised, his warm brown eyes crinkling with a smile. "One that knows how to love." And they had, until a drunk driver stole him away on a rain-slicked highway, leaving Abby to raise their twins alone. Now, as she faced emergency surgery with a 20% chance of complications, Abby had no one else to turn to. Her friends were scattered across the country, and her savings were drained from medical bills and the monthly $2,500 she'd been sending her parents since they took early retirement 3 years ago. She'd kept up the payments even after Nate's death, dipping into her graphic design income out of a sense of duty, hoping it might earn her a sliver of their affection. Swallowing her pride, she pressed the call button, her heart sinking as the screen flickered to life with her mother's impatient face. "Abby, what now?" Liz snapped, her voice sharp enough to slice through the hospital room stillness. In the background, Bill adjusted his tie, the two of them clearly dressed for a night out. "Don't you dare ask us to cancel our plans again. We've had these Elton John tickets for months." The words hit Abby like a punch to the gut, her breath catching as tears stung her eyes. "Mom, I'm in the hospital," she managed, her voice trembling. "They found internal bleeding. I need surgery tonight. It's serious. Can you watch Liam and Ava? Just for a few hours? Please?" Bill's face appeared on the screen, his gray eyes cold as steel. "You're becoming a real burden, Abigail. We're retired now. We deserve to enjoy our lives without your constant problems." He paused, then added with a sneer, "Besides, we're spending Christmas Eve with Lauren. She's got a big holiday party planned." Abby's mouth opened, but no words came. The pain in her abdomen flared, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her chest, a wound carved by years of neglect and sharpened by this final rejection. Her parents didn't even ask about the twins, their only grandchildren, who were blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. Liam stacked a red block on top of a blue one, his tiny tongue poking out in concentration, while Ava hugged a stuffed bunny to her chest, her big blue eyes, so like Nate's, darting toward her mother's tear-streaked face. "I've been sending you money every month," Abby whispered, her voice breaking. "Even after Nate died, I thought family was supposed to stick together." Liz rolled her eyes, her red lipstick a stark contrast to her pale, indifferent expression. "That's your choice, Abby. Don't guilt trip us now. We'll see you after the holidays, maybe." The call ended abruptly, leaving Abby staring at a blank screen, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the soft click of the door as Catherine Kate, a kind nurse in her late 30s, stepped into the room. She took one look at Abby's face and crossed the space in 3 strides, her hand resting gently on Abby's shoulder. "Hey, sweetie, what's going on?" Kate asked, her voice a soothing balm against the raw edges of Abby's pain. "They won't help," Abby choked out, tears spilling down her cheeks. "My parents, they'd rather go to a concert than watch their grandchildren while I might—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of leaving Liam and Ava orphaned, too unbearable to voice. The twins were too young to understand, but they'd already lost their father. If the surgery went wrong, who would love them the way she did? Kate squeezed her shoulder, her brown eyes warm with compassion. "Listen, I know someone who can help. Her name's Sophie. She's a professional nanny who specializes in childhood trauma. Used to work at the Children's Hospital before going private. Let me call her for you." Abby hesitated, the weight of her parents' rejection pressing down on her like a physical force. She'd spent her whole life seeking their approval, bending over backward to prove she was worthy of their love. But in that moment, with the pain searing through her body and the indifferent faces of Bill and Liz burned into her mind, something inside her shifted. She couldn't keep pouring herself into people who saw her as nothing more than a burden or a paycheck. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please call her." As Kate stepped out to make the call, Abby looked at Liam and Ava, their innocent laughter a lifeline in the storm. She made a silent promise to them and to herself that no matter what happened in that operating room, she would never let anyone make her feel small again. The first cut had been made, not by a surgeon's scalpel, but by her own resolve. She was done with the toxic ties that had bound her for too long. The fluorescent lights of the hospital room buzzed faintly as Abby Carter drifted in and out of consciousness, her body weak from the emergency surgery that had saved her life. The pain in her abdomen had dulled to a throbbing ache, but the sting of her parents' rejection lingered sharper than any scalpel's cut. 5 days had passed since that devastating Christmas Eve call. 5 days since William, Bill, and Elizabeth had chosen an Elton John concert over watching their grandchildren, while their daughter faced a 20% chance of not waking up. In those 5 days, Abby had made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. She was done with them. Sophie, the professional nanny Kate had called in, had been a godsend. A petite woman in her late 20s with a warm smile and a knack for soothing chaos, Sophie arrived within an hour of Kate's call that night and immediately connected with Liam and Ava. She'd stayed with the twins in the hospital room during the day, playing games and singing lullabies, and took them to Abby's apartment at night, ensuring they were cared for while Abby recovered. "How much will this cost?" Abby had asked, worry creasing her brow as she thought of the mounting medical bills and the limits of Nate's insurance coverage. Sophie had waved a hand dismissively, her hazel eyes kind. "Don't worry about that now. Let's focus on getting you better." But Abby couldn't help worrying. Lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by the sterile white walls and the distant hum of nurses' chatter, her mind churned with numbers. The $2,500 she'd been sending her parents each month. Money she'd scraped together even after Nate's death, even when it meant skipping meals herself. Could have covered Sophie's fees, maybe even started rebuilding the emergency fund that had been drained dry. The thought sparked a flame of anger in her chest, a flame that had been smoldering for years beneath layers of guilt and obligation. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone and sent 2 messages. The first was to her bank, canceling all future automatic transfers to her parents' account. The second was to Bill and Liz. "I will no longer be providing financial support. My children and I deserve better than being your afterthoughts. Don't contact me again." The response was immediate and brutal. Within hours, her phone lit up with notifications, 27 missed calls, a flood of texts, and a string of voicemails from her parents. Abby played the first one, her stomach nodding as Bill's voice crackled through the speaker. "You can't just cut us off like this, Abigail. We've got a cruise plan next month. Non-refundable tickets. The bank called about our mortgage payment. What the hell are we supposed to do now?" Not once did he ask about her surgery, her recovery, or how Liam and Ava were coping. Liz's messages were no better, a mix of crocodile tears and veiled threats. "We've come to depend on that money, sweetie. You're breaking our hearts." Abby deleted them all, her jaw tight, the flame in her chest burning brighter. Lauren's message was different. Her younger sister's voice trembled over the line, laced with confusion. "Mom and Dad said you were having some minor procedure. What's going on? Why are they freaking out about money?" It dawned on Abby that her parents had lied to Lauren, downplaying the severity of her situation to justify their choice of a concert over family. Groggy from painkillers, Abby typed out the truth in a single, raw message. "It was emergency surgery, Lauren. I could have died." "They didn't care." Lauren's reply came quickly. "Oh my God, Abby, I had no idea. They told me you were being dramatic about a routine checkup. I would have watched Liam and Ava if I'd known. I'm so sorry." For the first time in years, Abby felt a flicker of connection with her sister. A fragile thread, but one worth holding on to. By the time Abby was discharged, the weight of her decision to cut ties had settled into her bones. But her parents weren't done with her. A week after she returned home, a legal notice arrived in the mail, stamped with the logo of a local law firm. Bill and Liz were suing her, claiming she had a legal obligation to continue financial support based on a document she'd signed years ago, fresh out of college. Abby's stomach dropped as she read the details. She vaguely remembered signing something. Her parents had pressured her into it, threatening to cut contact if she didn't agree to help them after their early retirement. She'd been so desperate for their approval back then, so eager to prove she was a good daughter. Now, that desperate act was being weaponized against her. The first court hearing was a nightmare. Abby sat in the stiff wooden chair, her hands clammy as she faced her parents across the room. Bill's gray eyes were hard with resentment. Liz dabbed at crocodile tears with a tissue, playing the victim for the judge. Their lawyer, a slick man in a pinstripe suit, presented the document, a hastily scrawled agreement that Abby barely recognized, and then dropped a bombshell that made the room spin. "Your Honor, my clients acted in what they believed was their daughter's best interest," he said, his voice smooth as oil. When Abigail's late husband, Nathan, applied for a prestigious job overseas, they feared it would destabilize her life, so they sent an anonymous email to the company ensuring he wouldn't be selected. They wanted to keep her close, to protect her. The words hit Abby like a freight train. Nate had been devastated when he didn't get that job, a software engineering position in London that could have changed their lives. He had blamed himself, sinking into a quiet despair in the months before his death. Abby had never known why he had been rejected. The company had cited confidential concerns. Now, the truth crashed over her like a wave. Her parents had sabotaged him. They hadn't just neglected her, they'd actively hurt the one person who'd ever truly loved her. That night, alone in her apartment, Abby pulled out the old wooden box where she kept Nate's things. Inside was a letter he'd written after that rejection, his slanted handwriting a tether to a past she'd lost. "I didn't get the job, Abs," he'd written. "But it doesn't matter. You and the twins are my world. We'll build something even better right here." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the letter to her chest, the flame in her heart roaring into an inferno. Her parents had stolen more than money. They'd stolen a piece of Nate's dream, and maybe even a piece of the time they could have had together before he was gone. Abigail Abby Carter sat on the worn couch in her small Las Vegas apartment, a cup of lukewarm coffee cradled in her hands as the early morning light filtered through the blinds. 2 weeks had passed since her discharge from the hospital, and though the incision site on her abdomen still throbbed when she moved too quickly, she was starting to feel human again. Liam and Ava toddled around the living room, their laughter a balm to the raw edges of her heart. The twins were her anchor, their innocent joy a reminder of why she'd fought so hard to survive. Not just the surgery, but the betrayal of her parents, William Bill and Elizabeth Liz, who had turned their backs on her in her darkest hour. With Sophie's help, Abby had begun to rebuild her life, juggling her graphic design clients from home and leaning on the unexpected kindness of neighbors who dropped off casseroles and homemade cookies with notes of encouragement. Rachel, a real estate agent Abby had met through a support group for young widowed parents, had been a lifeline too. A single mother herself, Rachel had helped Abby find and purchase a modest 3-bedroom house in a family-friendly neighborhood on the outskirts of Las Vegas. The mortgage payments were somehow less than her apartment rent, and the twins now had a tiny backyard where they could chase butterflies and roll in the grass. It wasn't much, but it felt like a fresh start, a safe haven from the chaos of her parents' lawsuit and the haunting revelation that they'd sabotaged Nate's chance at a dream job years ago. That betrayal still gnawed at her. A wound reopened every time she thought of the letter Nate had left behind. His words of love and resilience now tinged with the bitter knowledge of what her parents had done. Lauren's visits had become a bright spot in those fragile weeks. Abby's younger sister had been horrified to learn the truth about their parents' actions during Abby's surgery. And though their relationship had always been strained by Bill and Liz's favoritism, Lauren seemed determined to make amends. She showed up twice a week with bags of groceries and home-cooked meals. Lasagna, chicken pot pie, anything to ease Abby's burden. One evening, as they watched Liam and Ava stack blocks into a wobbly tower, Lauren admitted, "They always made it seem like you were choosing to distance yourself from the family. I never realized they were pushing you away." Abby nodded, the confession a small bridge between them, though trust would take time to rebuild. But the fragile piece Abby had carved out shattered one crisp afternoon when her phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. The nanny's words sent ice through her veins. "Abby, your parents showed up at the preschool, tried to take Liam and Ava. I stopped them, but they're acting erratic. Where are you?" Abby's heart lurched into her throat as she dialed Sophie back. Her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Sophie's voice was steady but urgent on the other end. "They claimed to be legal guardians, showed some fake paperwork to the school staff. I got there just as they were signing the kids out. They left, but they were yelling about needing to talk to you, something about money." Abby's mind raced. The lawsuit hadn't gone their way. Her lawyer had argued that the document she'd signed years ago wasn't legally binding, and the judge had seemed sympathetic to Abby's side. But Bill and Liz were desperate now. Their lakefront house, a 4,000 square foot monument to their lavish lifestyle, was on the brink of foreclosure. Lauren had told Abby they'd taken out a second mortgage to buy a boat last year, assuming Abby's monthly payments would keep them afloat. Now with that lifeline severed, they were spiraling. And apparently willing to cross lines Abby hadn't thought possible. Another text came through, this one from Liz's number. "If you don't send the money today, I'm not sure Liam and Ava will be safe." The words hit Abby like a punch, her breath catching as panic clawed at her chest. She didn't believe her parents would truly harm the twins, not physically, but the threat alone was enough to send her spiraling. She called 911, her voice trembling as she explained the situation to the dispatcher, then grabbed her keys and raced to the preschool with Sophie's directions ringing in her ears. They'd last been seen heading toward a nearby park. The park was a blur of autumn leaves and playground equipment as Abby pulled into the lot, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Sophie was already there, standing by the swings with a school staff member, her face pale but determined. "They took off toward the picnic area," Sophie said, pointing. "I called the cops too. They're on their way." Abby nodded, barely hearing her, and broke into a run, her incisions screaming in protest with every step. She spotted them near a cluster of picnic tables. Bill pacing with his arms crossed, Liz clutching her designer purse like a shield, and Liam and Ava sitting on a bench looking confused and scared. Ava clutched her stuffed bunny, her blue eyes wide while Liam clung to her hand, his tiny brow furrowed. "Mommy?" Ava cried, her voice cutting through the crisp air as she saw Abby approach. Abby's knees nearly buckled with relief, but fury surged through her as Liz turned, her expression a mix of defiance and panic. "What the hell are you doing?" Abby shouted, her voice raw as she closed the distance between them. "They're my children. We just wanted to talk," Bill snapped, his gray eyes flashing. "You've left us no choice, Abigail. We're drowning without that money." "You don't get to threaten my kids." Abby's voice cracked as she scooped Liam and Ava into her arms, their small bodies trembling against hers, but in the chaos, Liz made a desperate move, lunging forward as if to grab Ava back. "We're their grandparents!" she shrieked. In her haste, she stumbled, her hand catching Ava's arm and sending the little girl tumbling to the ground with a sharp cry. A scrape loomed red on Ava's knee, and her wails pierced the air. Abby dropped to her knees, pulling Ava close as tears streamed down her face. "You've done enough," she choked out, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "Get away from us." Sirens wailed in the distance as police cars pulled into the park, officers spilling out to restrain Bill and Liz, who were now shouting excuses and pleas. Abby barely heard them, her world narrowing to the feel of her children in her arms, their tears soaking into her shirt. That night, after the police had taken her parents into custody for attempted abduction and threats, Abby sat on the floor of her apartment, Liam and Ava curled against her sides. The twins were shaken but safe, their soft snores a fragile comfort as Abby stared into the dark. Then, in a voice so small it broke her heart, Liam whispered, "Mommy, don't cry. I'll protect you." The words from her 3-year-old son shattered her, tears spilling anew as she hugged him tighter, vowing never to let anyone hurt them again. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled Abigail Carter's small Las Vegas apartment as she sat at her kitchen table, a laptop open in front of her, and a pile of legal papers stacked to her left. It had been 3 weeks since the harrowing incident at the park, where her parents, William Bill and Elizabeth Liz, had tried to take Liam and Ava in a desperate bid to force her hand. The twins were slowly recovering from the ordeal. Sophie had suggested a child therapist to help them process the fear, and their laughter was beginning to return, though Abby still caught Ava clutching her stuffed bunny a little tighter at night. But the legal storm hadn't abated. Bill and Liz were out on bail, awaiting trial for attempted abduction and threats. And the civil lawsuit they'd filed against Abby, claiming she owed them financial support, was still looming like a dark cloud. Abby rubbed her temples, exhaustion seeping into her bones. Her graphic design clients had been understanding about her limited availability, but the medical bills from her surgery were piling up, and the cost of Sophie's part-time help wasn't cheap, even with the nanny's generous discounts. Yet, amidst the chaos, glimmers of hope had emerged. Rachel, the real estate agent from her support group for young widowed parents, had finalized the paperwork for Abby's new 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. The move-in date was set for next month, and the thought of Liam and Ava running through a backyard of their own brought a rare smile to her face. Jake, her cousin, had also stepped up, publicly calling out Bill and Liz's behavior on social media after learning the full story, rallying other family members to Abby's side with his blunt honesty. "Uncle Bill, Aunt Liz, you don't get to play victims when you chose a concert over your daughter's life." Lauren's support had been the most unexpected gift. Abby's younger sister had started spending weekends at the apartment, helping with the twins and bringing meals to ease Abby's load. One Saturday evening, as they sat on the floor watching Liam and Ava build a tower of mismatched blocks, Lauren opened up in a way she never had before. "I always thought you pulled away because you didn't want us," she admitted, her voice soft. "Mom and Dad made it sound like you were too busy for family. I never saw how they treated you, like you didn't matter." Abby swallowed hard, the confession stirring a mix of gratitude and lingering hurt. "They built that wall, Lauren," she said quietly. "But I'm glad you're here now." Lauren nodded, her eyes misty, and for the first time, Abby felt like she might have a real sister after all. But the fragile progress was tested when Aunt Margaret Maggie, Liz's older sister and the self-proclaimed family peacemaker, inserted herself into the fray. Maggie had always positioned herself as neutral, but a late-night scroll through Facebook revealed a different story. Maggie had posted a lengthy rant, accusing Abby of abandoning her parents in their time of need and abusing the legal system to punish them. The post twisted the truth into knots, painting Bill and Liz as struggling retirees betrayed by their ungrateful daughter. Worst of all, Maggie revealed a private detail Lauren had let slip in a moment of frustration. Years ago, before Nate's death, Abby had briefly considered adoption, overwhelmed by postpartum depression and the fear that she couldn't be a good mother. Maggie spun it into a vicious lie. Abigail never wanted those twins. She's unfit to raise them, always has been. The post went viral within their extended family circles, racking up shares and comments from distant relatives and old acquaintances who didn't know the full story. Abby's inbox filled with messages. Some supportive, but others cruel, questioning her fitness as a mother and her loyalty as a daughter. A few of her graphic design clients even emailed to cancel projects, citing concerns about her reliability. The betrayal cut deep, reopening wounds Abby had fought so hard to heal. She sat on her couch that night, staring at the glowing screen, tears blurring her vision as she read comment after comment, tearing her apart. How could Maggie do this? And how could Lauren have shared something so personal, even if it wasn't intentional? Lauren showed up the next morning, her face pale and her hands wringing a scarf as she stammered an apology. Abby, I swear I didn't mean for this to happen. I was arguing with Maggie, trying to defend you, and it just slipped out. I had no idea she'd twist it like this. Abby wanted to scream, to lash out at her sister for breaking her trust, but the exhaustion in Lauren's eyes stopped her. Instead, she asked, "What else have you told them?" Lauren hesitated, then admitted their parents had been pressuring her to convince Abby to drop the charges against them. "They threatened to cut me out of the will," Lauren whispered. "Said they'd disown me if I didn't get you to back off. But I told them I'm done. They can keep their money. I choose you." The confession hit Abby like a wave, and for a moment the sisters just sat there, the weight of their shared history heavy between them. Then Lauren pulled a small suitcase from behind the door. "I left their house for good," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You're my family now." Abby's eyes welled up, and she pulled Lauren into a tight hug, their tears mingling as years of distance dissolved in that quiet embrace. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it was a start. Amidst the betrayal, the community Abby had built began to shine through. A neighbor she barely knew left a box of homemade cookies on her doorstep with a note, "You're the strongest mom I've ever seen. Don't give up." Rachel organized a Zoom playdate for Liam and Ava with other kids from the support group, giving Abby a few hours to catch her breath. Even Jake sent a care package, microwave popcorn, a bottle of cheap wine, and a note that read, "Screw Maggie. We've got your back." These small acts of kindness stitched together the frayed edges of Abby's resolve, reminding her that family wasn't just blood. It was the people who showed up when you needed them most. But as the trial date for Bill and Liz approached, a new weight settled on Abby's shoulders. Late one night, after the twins were asleep, she found an envelope slipped under her door. A handwritten letter from Bill, the first he'd ever sent her. His scrawl was shaky, the words raw. "I know I've been a terrible father, Abigail. I failed you in ways I can't undo. But I used to dream of a happy family, all of us together. I broke that dream myself. If you want me gone for good, I'll go." The letter shook her to her core, stirring memories of a father who'd once held her hand at her grandmother's funeral, a fleeting moment of tenderness in a lifetime of neglect. Was he manipulating her again, or was this genuine remorse? Abigail Abby Carter stood in the dimly lit courtroom of the Clark County District Court, her hands clenched at her sides as the weight of the past 3 months pressed down on her like a lead blanket. The air was thick with tension, the faint murmur of spectators filling the gallery behind her as she faced her parents, William, Bill, and Elizabeth Liz, across the room. The trial for their attempted abduction of Liam and Ava and the threats they'd made in the park had finally arrived, a reckoning for the chaos they'd unleashed on Abby's life. Bill sat hunched in his chair, his once imposing frame diminished by weeks in custody, while Liz dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her performance of victimhood as polished as ever. Abby's lawyer had laid out a damning case. The fake guardianship papers, the threatening text, the scrape on Ava's knee from Liz's reckless shove. But as the judge prepared to hear Abby's final statement, a new decision loomed. One that could either cement her freedom or drag her back into the toxic web of her parents' control. The night before the trial, Abby had sat up until dawn, Bill's handwritten letter spread out on her kitchen table like a grenade with the pin half pulled. His words echoed in her mind. "I know I've been a terrible father, Abigail. I've failed you in ways I can't undo. If you want me gone for good, I'll go." The letter had stirred something in her, a flicker of the father she'd once known, the one who'd held her hand at her grandmother's funeral and called her his light through his own tears. But it also raised doubts. Was this another manipulation, a last-ditch effort to soften her resolve? Or was it genuine remorse? A crack in the armor of a man who'd spent decades prioritizing his own desires over his daughter's needs. Abby didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her as she weighed her options. Stick to her testimony and let her parents face the full consequences, or soften her stance and propose a lighter sentence with conditions. Therapy, supervised visits only, a chance for them to prove they could change. The choice became even more agonizing when, just hours before the trial, a call from the county jail turned her world upside down again. Bill had suffered a sudden stroke in his cell, a massive one that left him unconscious and clinging to life with a 50% chance of survival, if he received emergency surgery immediately. The catch? He needed a family member to sign off on the procedure, and with Liz too emotionally unstable to make decisions and Lauren refusing to have any part of it, Abby was the only one left with legal authority to act. The jail nurse's voice was calm but urgent over the phone. "We need your decision within the hour, Ms. Carter. Without surgery, he'll likely slip away by morning." Abby drove to the hospital in a daze, the Las Vegas skyline blurring through the tears she couldn't hold back. She stood beside Bill's bed in the ICU, the steady beep of the heart monitor a cruel counterpoint to the storm inside her. He looked small under the tangle of tubes and wires, his gray hair disheveled, his face slack in unconsciousness. For a moment, she was 8 years old again, sitting on his lap at her grandmother's funeral, his arms around her as he whispered, "You're my light, Abby girl." It was the only memory she had of him showing her love, a single thread in a tapestry of neglect, manipulation, and betrayal. And yet, as she looked at him now, that thread tugged at her heart, weaving itself into the guilt and anger that had defined their relationship for so long. Her fingers hovered over the consent form, trembling as memories of the past few months flooded her mind. Bill's cold refusal to help during her surgery, the lawsuit that had drained her savings, the terror in Liam and Ava's eyes when Liz had pushed Ava to the ground in that park. But another image came unbidden. Liam's tiny voice that night after the park incident, whispering, "Mommy, don't cry. I'll protect you." If she let Bill die without signing, would she carry that weight for the rest of her life? Would it poison the love she poured into her children, the love she'd fought so hard to preserve? With a sob that tore from her chest, Abby signed the form, her tears splattering onto the paper as she whispered to the unconscious man before her, "I'm doing this for me, not you, so I don't have to live with regret." The nurse took the form with a nod, and Abby sank into a chair, her body shaking as the reality of what she'd done settled in. She hadn't forgiven him, not yet, maybe not ever, but she'd chosen to let him live, to give him a chance to face the consequences of his actions, whatever they might be. The trial resumed the next day, with word that Bill's surgery had been successful, though his recovery would be long and uncertain. Abby stood before the judge, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She didn't withdraw her testimony. She couldn't erase the harm her parents had done. But she proposed an alternative to prison: a suspended sentence with mandatory community service, court-ordered therapy, and a strict no-contact order unless under supervised conditions. "My children deserve to know their grandparents," she said, her gaze locked on Liz's tear-streaked face, but only if they can prove they've changed. I won't risk their safety, or mine, on empty promises. The judge agreed, and as the gavel fell, Abby felt a strange lightness in her chest. Not forgiveness, but freedom. She walked out of the courtroom and into the waiting arms of Lauren, who'd been there every step of the way since leaving their parents' house. Together, they drove to Abby's new home, where Sophie, Rachel, and Jake had organized a small welcome party with the twins. Balloons bobbed in the backyard, and Liam and Ava squealed with delight as they chased bubbles in the fading sunlight. Inspired by her journey, Abby launched a community program called The Light of Nate, a support network for single parents struggling to rebuild after loss. At the opening event, with Liam and Ava clinging to her legs and a crowd of new friends gathered around, she spoke from the heart. We can lose so much: people, dreams, trust, but as long as we have love, we can always start again. Her voice cracked as she looked at her children, their smiles brighter than the sunset behind them, and for the first time in months, Abby felt whole.